morning, fellow Toastmasters.
Morning.
Morning.
I want to let you know I'm excited about this book I'm reading. It's entitled Setting the Record Straight, American History in Black and White. A friend of mine recommended this book to me. It's been a marvelous book to read so far. Reading the back of the book, it says, Setting the Record Straight reintroduces this generation to the forgotten heroes and untold stories from our rich African-American political history. I have not been disappointed about this book at all. We've all heard about the 1619 Project, the bad, tragic day when African-Americans were forced to come to this country. They don't bother to talk about the Massachusetts colony that were Christian pilgrims. You know what they did when a slave ship showed up? They threw those men in jail. They took care of the slaves that came over, and at their own expense, they sent them home. They don't talk about that history very much, do they? And I learned about that in this book. There's a very famous picture of them crossing the Delaware in a boat, and you see George Washington standing and people rowing. Did you know that in that picture there are two African Americans that are rowing with them? Two patriots. Their names are Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell. I didn't know that. It seems that most of our black political history was widely known in previous generations, but in this generation it's been somewhat forgotten. That's one of the reasons why this book was written. And when you look at the 56 founders of the Declaration of Independence, people are quick to say that Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. I understand they're wanting to remove his statue in New York right now, but you're hard to find the number 2 one. That's what I understand. It just seems like black history is presented too much from a Southern perspective, talking about oppression, talking about slavery, atrocities, and all the numerous civil rights violations. Now, Frederick Douglass, I'm certain everyone's heard about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave. He became educated when he fled to the North. Originally, he felt that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were racist documents pointing to the 3/5 rule. But when he actually found out the reason why they did that is that the South wanted to count all their slaves in their representation in Congress. In Georgia, 50% of the people were slaves. Some of the people north said, essentially, you treat them as property, as having no rights, but yet you want to count them for representation. And they would not be able to bring the southern states into the country if they did not have some compromise. The 3/5 rule was only done for political representation. It was even argued, can the Northerners count their horses for representation? It was really ridiculous, and there's a lot of writings talking about how unjust this is. You're counting people to vote and have your representation, but yet you deny those very people the right to representation. Now, one thing interesting about Frederick Douglass is that he actually had cabinet positions for four of the presidents, except when I think Grover Cleveland, who was a Democrat, was in the office. He was shown the door when he became president. Now, one thing that's interesting is Thomas Jefferson is credited for founding the Democratic Party in 1792, and this will actually be important to remember in a later discussion that I give. Now, does anyone know what 1808 is? An incredibly famous date in American history. Can anyone in this room tell me what happened in 1808? Anyone? Does anyone know who Aslam Jones is? He's an incredibly famous preacher, African-American preacher. And he gave this incredibly great sermon to celebrate what happened in 1808 because it was monumental, especially for African-Americans. It was the date that Congress outlawed the slave trade. They had realized that that is an abomination and it needs to end. And in 1808, they ended it. And very few people know that we ended the slave trade. We ended it ahead of England. I think in a previous speech, the slave trade continued until like 1830. That is an amazing thing to know. It's interesting in a way, going back to something I said earlier, in our Constitution, the preamble, it says that it's self-evident that we are endowed by certain unalienable rights from our Creator, to the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That means all of us, slave and free. And it's interesting to me that this big debate over representation, that is in the Constitution. And the founders had a vision for what our country should be. When you look back in the early part of the 19th century, although slavery had not been abolished in all the states, it seemed that things were really moving in the right direction. Yet, there was a major reversal about to happen. And I will talk about that in a future speech.